you have a Jabber client? Could you be the Jabber relay? Thank you very much. All right. Great. Yeah. No. Technically, we're supposed to start right now. Okay. Given that people are still collecting their drinks and their cookies, we'll give another couple of moments before we begin. I'm informed that they're not collecting their cookies, they're rounding up pitchforks to be mad that there are no more cookies, which might take a moment or two longer. So we'll still give them a moment or two to collect the pitchforks, the tar, the feathers, whatever's required. Nearby. He just went, he's sitting right there. See, that's some speaker. Yeah. Do you have the speaker? Absolutely. Yeah, slide your actually, it's a slide back thing called gate data. So it's one of the components in the different. I've used it myself. Okay. You got feeling Richard? Okay. Yeah. Estimados señores y señoras, bienvenidos a Argentina, a Buenos Aires y a IETF. We're very happy to have you join us here at IETF 95. This is about to be the Acme working group. If you were not planning to be at Acme, apparently we're going to be RTC Web. If you don't want to be part of the Acme working group, this would be a moment to wonder why you're in this room. Presumably, while we're a little confused about whether we're RTC Web or Acme, your friendly chairs are indeed Rich and Ted. Our area director is Kathleen Moriarty, currently attending remotely most sessions, so probably not with us today. Stephen Farrell is available should we need the sudden advice of an area director. Meet Echo will be for remote participation. If you have an XMPP client, Jabber, we will be at acme@jabber.ietf.org. We have a Jabber relay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry? Thank you. We also have a scribe in the form of George Michelson. Thank you very much, George. On to the agenda. Note well. So this is a summary. It's not our actual IPR policy, which is deeply complicated and only understood by lawyers. You should invoke your lawyers at once if you have not already invoked them. In the meantime, Please review our BCPs to this effect. There's definitive information in BCP 9, 25, 54, 78, and 79.
Bingo.
For advice, please talk to some other set of working group chairs, or if absolutely necessary, Rich and me, or your ADs. That's him standing back there. He's happy to give you IPR advice at any time. But basically, don't talk if you have IPR and aren't willing to say so. Next slide. All right, this is our agenda. Agenda bashing can commence now, but the current thing is we'll do a review of closed issues from Richard, then open issues. Then Phil will talk to us a little bit about the lurk draft, which is actually advanced since 00. And then Rich will talk about, are we done yet? Is there any agenda bashing to be done at this time? All right, I hear a train or possibly a large trolley, but no agenda bashing. Given that, Richard, you're up. Here is your pink box, my dear friend.
Step into the box. All right, so this working group has one deliverable and one draft. Acme, Acme, Acme. Next slide, please. All right, so Chair's asked me to do a quick review of what we've gotten done since the last IETF meeting. Turns out it's non-zero. We merged 52 pull requests since the last IETF meeting. When I looked back, it was like, wow, that's a lot of work. I don't remember doing that much work. And thankfully, that was due to 14 different contributors who contributed some text to the spec. So I think that's, hey, community participation. Great. So if you submit some text, you could be part of this group too. I'm glad to have contributions from whoever's interested. So the remainder of this is not going to cover all 52 of those because a lot of them were typo fixes and things like that. They're not super interesting, but I've got some highlights. Next slide, please. So we removed some stuff. I think we discussed most of this on the list. The more obvious one is we removed the proof of possession challenge because nobody was using it, and it didn't sort of fit within the overall framework of the other challenges, and so it made things a little bit simpler. If it ultimately turns out that people want to use something like this, we can of course bring it back as an extension because we have an extensible challenge space. So it made sense to, it was a low-risk operation to take it out of the base spec, so we did. Likewise, there was a little bit of thrash and multiple PRs around removing account recovery, but right now, as the spec stands, we don't have a way to recover your account if you lose your account private key. You're just, it's up to whatever the CA might implement out of band, outside of Acme, to let you get back in. We had previously had a Mac-based scheme, a contact-based scheme. We removed the Mac-based scheme as a result of some discussions at the last meeting, and removed the contact-based one a little bit later. So I think that's gone right now, but it's likely to come back. So Karthik Bhargavan from INRIA did some analysis on Acme that confirmed our suspicions that contact-based recovery was not so great and could actually be hijacked in one way. So he suggested some ways it might make sense to bring it back. I'll talk about rollover in a second, but it turns out that account key rollover and account recovery can be made to look largely the same. So we're actually going to I've got a proposal to refactor recovery to basically make account recovery free. So I think some form of recovery should be coming back pretty soon, even though we deleted it for now. Next slide, please. Account management. As we've had some folks deploying Acme in operations with Let's Encrypt, we've gotten some feedback about people's needs to manage their accounts in band in Acme. So we added a way to roll over account keys. Account keys, you might remember, are the way that a client is identified to an Acme server. It's the way the client authenticates. And so you might be concerned that if you use one of those for a long time, what if it gets compromised? So you might want to roll them over every so often to make sure it's fresh and not stolen. So the way we added, the mechanism we added here, you create an object that says, I would like to move to this new key, and then it's signed by both the old key and the new key. So both the original key and the new key assent to the rollover. And once the server receives that message, it swaps out the new key, and the new key is the new key from then on. So there's a specific construct for that double signature in there right now. We'll hit that in a couple of slides. There's going to be a proposal to refactor that a little bit, but it's pretty minor. Another account management feature we added was the ability to delete accounts and authorizations. So if you wanted to say, I am no longer going to deal with the CA, I don't want them to know about me, you can delete your account. If you would like to say, I no longer own this domain, I would be able to not, too many negatives, I would like to disclaim my ability to issue certificates for it. As a courtesy to the CA to guard against misissuance, you can delete your authorizations. Pretty simple object there. You identify the thing you want, the class of resource you want to delete, and you say delete this, and then you sign it with your account key. That's so simple that it makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit, so I'd appreciate analysis and review. But that's where it stands in the document as it is now. Next slide, please. So yeah, we had a security issue. Bitly was looking at deploying TLS for their HTTPS sites, or deploying using Acme to get certificates for their TLS on custom domains. And as they were developing, noticed that we have an issue with this TLS SNI challenge that could lead to insecure configurations. So the idea was that in TLS SNI 01, the original version of the challenge, the request that the CA would send out to the the TLS server for validation had all the information that the server needed to respond to that challenge. So in principle, you could create a server that just happily responded to any challenge that showed up, regardless of whether it had ever heard of this before. And what this would create a way for a malicious client to tell a CA, a client that could DNS redirect the CA to such a server to validate any domain it wanted, because it could send the TLS SNI challenge and it would come back valid, regardless of whether the TLS server actually represented the domain in question. So we fixed that in TLS SNI 02 by following the same pattern we do in the HTTP and DNS challenges, where the information in the request is insufficient to generate the response. So the validation server that's supposed to represent the domain has to have some specific information that is provided out of band to Acme. And so that ensures you can't end up in this insecure configuration. Next slide. Added some more metadata for Acme servers. So we had a request come in from a developer saying, gee, I'd like to be able to present the terms of service before I do any transactions as opposed to after I create an account, and I'd like to be able to poll for the terms URI. So we created this metadata element in the directory where you can stick things like a terms URI, and I think a couple of other things have gotten added in there since then. I think there's 3 or 4 defined now. But the idea is, the directory was there to tell you first what the API endpoints for the different functions in Acme. And it makes sense to use that same place to provide other metadata about the server in addition to the API endpoints. Other piece of metadata we added in to better support certificate transparency. You can now have a link relation that points to a signed certificate timestamp, which is what you need to prove that your certificate was logged. For a CA that supports certificate transparency and is getting SCTs as part of its issuance process, the CA can now provide this link to provide a link to the SCT if it's not doing include the SCT in the cert flavor of CT. I think that's the last. Is there more there? Yeah. Any questions, comments about that sort of stuff? Yeah.
Yaron Sheffer, back to account deletion.
Yeah.
In an attempt to complicate it, would it make sense to return a receipt to the caller, a signed receipt saying, yes, I just deleted your account and this is something you can show your auditor?
That seems like a really good idea. I think right now the response from the server is just a 200 OK. I deleted it. Yeah, if you have an idea for what would go in that response, I would be interested. Maybe
some assertion with a timestamp.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not immediately clear to me what you would put in such a receipt, but yeah, I'd be glad to hear proposals. It seems like an interesting idea. Thanks. Other comments? Questions? All right, we're well ahead of time, I guess.
So if I could ask you to repeat your suggestion either onto the list or as an issue in the GitHub tracker, either one would be great, just so that it's recorded that way. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, on to the open issue.
All right, open issues. As I did last time, I've got a bunch. I'm going to sort of try and proceed from obvious to non-obvious. So hopefully we'll breeze through the first couple slides and then get talking as we go. So I've got these listed by issue number or pull request. I just went through the repo this morning and grabbed everything. If you have an issue, it's not an issue in GitHub, sorry, file it, and we'll get around to it. So a couple of miscellaneous things. There was a proposal to add what was called conditional authorization creation and search. And the idea was I might have a client that doesn't know whether it's authorized for example.com. And when it sends in a new authorization request, I don't want it to create a second authorization for example.com for the same account. I might want to flag that I'm willing to reuse the existing authorization if there's one there already. So I think this just adds a comma existing true to the new authorization request to say I'm willing to reuse the existing authorization. What that lets you do is see if there's one existing, and that's what the search says. So my proposal is just to merge this. It seems like a pretty innocuous change and easy to support on both ends. Any objection to that? Seeing generally okay looks, no one jumping up to object. Okay, so we'll count that as merged. Likewise, rate limits. Rate limits are something that a lot of folks in clients of Let's Encrypt have run into in practice because Let's Encrypt has had very low rate limits because they've tried to start up slowly. And so there's some, this section is, the proposed change, I believe, is some normative, some proposal for how you use HTTP's rate limiting semantics to tell a client they've been rate limited and then suggest how long they wait before they try again. So we already have a rate limited error that was added in a pull request since the last cycle. So this would just augment that to say, when you send a rate limited error, also send a retry after header to say, dear client, here's how long you should wait before you try this request again. So that's a pretty minor change. I'm probably just going to merge it, unless someone objects here. Okay. Rich, you proposed this question of how to respond to bad new certificate requests. So context here is, client can send in a new certificate request that has some parameters in it. It specifies some validity, it specifies a whole bunch of names that the client wants to insert, things like that. And in principle, the CA can take that request and issue a certificate that doesn't match it if it doesn't like the inputs. So if the client asks for a 20-year cert, the CA could say, I'm not going to issue a 20-year cert, I'll just issue a 1-year cert and hand that cert back, even though it doesn't match what the client requested. And so there's a need to clarify, as the issue points out, clarify in what cases the CA should modify the request and go ahead and issue, and in what cases the CA should just fail. What I'd like to propose as the change we should make here is that if the CA can't explicitly match what the client has requested, then it should fail the request instead of issuing what the CA wants to issue. That seems more explicit to clients, easier to debug, things like that. Seeing nodding from Ted, Rich is going to Mike.
Yeah, Rich Salt. Yeah, it's better to not issue because it's no longer with certificate transparency a private issue between the CA and the client. You may have the CA issuing something that it thinks is okay but isn't good, and third parties will see it and know.
That's an interesting point.
So is the expectation that there'll be some piece of text that will tell the person what to do?
That's an interesting follow-on consequence of this issue. We should probably cover in the resolution here. I'm not totally sure how to do that because, you could come up with this whole grab bag of error cases that you could run into, or just return, I don't like your CSR. I think we have a bad CSR response right now.
Well, I mean, there clearly must be a freeform mess. There clearly must be either an error taxonomy or a piece of text that says you must do this.
Or both.
But clearly it's not acceptable to be like, no. And I won't tell you what your problem is, right?
So the error document format we have right now, we're using something that AppSog came up with a while back. It has a URN that uniquely identifies it. It's got some text, and I think it's got a link to more details. So it seems like within that framework, between some combination of set of error codes and text, you could get at something sort of useful.
Okay, and really this has to have guidance that says you should just provide enough detail that the person can resolve the issue.
Yes, agreed.
Ted Hardy from the floor. My suggestion here is that if what we're talking about is a set of errors where a modification to the request would have resulted in success, that what should be returned in that extra pointer is a description of what would have succeeded. So if the problem was they asked for 20 years and your maximum willingness is 1 year, that what you should return at that pointer is the constructed request that would have succeeded. Now, this is only really tractable if there was only one thing wrong, right? Otherwise, when you construct the request that you would have actually done, there may be a set of combinatorial things that you would have said, well, if you were not asking for a wild card, I would have given you 2 years, but you were asking for a wild card, so I'm only willing to give you 6 months. So here's one thing that would have succeeded. Don't ask me for a wild card and then get your 2 years, or ask me for 6 months with your wild card. So it's not a perfect solution, but it gives you something that's got a little bit more structure than either just no or, gee, could you call me because I'm kind of worried about our relationship and maybe it's complicated. you don't really want the Facebook response here. So it gives us some aspect of structure that might be useful.
Well, and I don't think it necessarily follows from the existence of combinatorial possibilities that the CA can't pick one and say, this, for example, this would be acceptable to me.
Well, the problem is that in the simple case, what you're probably going to return is the maximum you would have done, right? I would have given you a year when you asked for 20. For the combinatorial, my advice would actually be the reverse. You give the minimum that you would have supported. And since that's a fairly different strategy, we could certainly suggest that, but you're right, you could pick something.
I mean, you could do something like send back the request that a client could send, and the client can look at that and just okay, I'm sorry, never mind.
Bad idea. We'll go into that in a minute.
Stefan.
I'm just a little bit confused. We're talking about an automated protocol.
Yes.
Well,
as automated as we can make it.
Well, yeah, but is it sensible in an automated protocol to have detailed text messages? I mean, something must be fundamentally wrong if you even get a bad CSR into the setup, and whether you can resolve that this way. I'm from other like protocols where detailed error messages and stuff, it ended up being like a black hole that didn't work anyway, and you have to resolve it at a higher level.
So I'm concerned about the suggestion you just made and I got up to be concerned about the suggestion for precisely the reason you were suggesting earlier about changing TLSS and IO2. So imagine that situation where I have shared the same authorization key between two CAs. And now I blindly sign whatever crap the CA sends me as the request I should have sent. Now I'm a sad panda. So yeah, I think that, basically, like, the one thing you absolutely must not do is provide someone with something which they can blindly take and regenerate and pass out.
Yeah, I can do it.
I mean, you see my point, right?
So I jokingly said this sotto voce to Richard, but let me ask if this would make sense. If what you actually did was you generated the CSR that you would have accepted, you diff it against the CSR they said, and you gave a pointer to just the diff. So it's not a complete CSR, so it could not be blindly signed, but it could be relatively easily examined.
I mean, I guess I'm concerned about anything which encourages the client to mechanically attempt to take arbitrary stuff from the CA and change it. And so, I mean, consider the example you just gave me, right? So consider the case I indicated. I've shared my, I have two CAs, like one's an enterprise CA that I trust for enterprise purposes, and other's an internet CA. And, and so you provide me now with a new CSR, which is a CSR over a key. The enterprise CA provides me with a CSR that is a CSR with a public key that the enterprise CA knows. And now I've just issued for the enterprise CA certificate with my internet domain. That's clearly not cool.
Well,
And so if you're saying you give me a diff, the natural thing for you to do is to apply that diff.
I mean, you could do something about mitigating those by placing constraints on what the client could accept back, right? Like if the public key had to be the same.
I mean,
At least.
but these seem like exactly the kinds of things that would be checks that would be easily to omit. And so I guess my point is what you is like. I guess my concern basically is, except for the very few number of cases where it's like, I would have liked a shorter expiry period, or I would have liked, a longer ECDSA key or something like that. Like, how many things are actually mechanically repairable within the context of the client? Right. And even like I would have taken a shorter expiry date. Seems like something which, like, maybe the person wants to review. So I guess I'd be much happy. I think if we're going to go down this route, I'd be much happier with a actual taxonomy of mechanical errors than with some free-form diff format followed by checking. Because I mean, even if you attempted the checking, this is the same, you could easily scrub.
Problem again. Hi, this is Debbie Coulinan from, oh man, this thing really works. I'm from NSA. So we're still talking about 47, right?
Yes, we're on issue 47.
Okay, good.
This is the easy section too.
Yeah, so don't make this complicated, right? Don't issue it. Obviously, you're not going to issue it. Send them back a message with a phone number. Why go high tech with this, right? Isn't it easier just to give them a phone number and let them call your help desk and say, what the hell did I do?
I think at least we can make a URL.
Okay. With the phone number in it.
Well, I mean, if we have a URL, right, the CA knows what's wrong with it, and so it can spin up a web page if it wants.
Yeah,
that
so
says
you,
these
so
three
you may
things are
know
wrong.
what's wrong with it, right? I mean, you know why you rejected it. So you can say that in the message back. We rejected it because you asked for a 20-year cert. We don't do that.
Right.
Here, call us up if you have issues with this.
I think the impulse Ted was trying to come across with is it would be nice if you could automatically recover from these errors, assuming the CA suggestion was acceptable to the client. But I think I'm coming around to Ecker's position. That's not really viable.
No, I think you need to, well, he has to re-sign the request.
Yeah.
Right. And you can't let him out of that, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all wish this whole thing could be automated, even in the most disagreeable policy
I think in that
cases.
case, the low-tech solution is really your best. I mean, it's your most foolproof solution.
Yeah.
Because you make him come back and.
Yeah, I think, this is the point where you pop out of the automation and you call the humans in.
I gotta help.
Mark Donnelly, I wonder if it'd be worth looking at it from kind of the other side of things, more towards the generation side. You've already put forth the idea of having a metadata in the directory. Maybe you could throw in some set of the rules for the CA into the directory metadata and have the clients check that before they send forth the request, and be able to give the user direct feedback that says, no, you can't get that for 20 years. You have it for 6 months at most.
Yeah, I hesitate to get into a policy description language, but I think.
Totally fair.
Yeah, but if you have, I would be delighted to have a PR to hash over if you wanted to like sketch something out for a few different parameters. Yes.
Hi, Eric Berger. I think the thing is we've got, or on the list, of course, we'll get the consensus that you're not going to issue a certificate. And I think the other thing I'm hearing a lot of, and we actually built one of these too, and there are so many different ways that the human screws up that it is a matter of local policy what you do and how you communicate it. I think the only thing we will really automate is it's broken.
All right, so we seem to have consensus around that. Let me try and sum up. We will fail, and try and return some helpful information, but not necessarily helpful to a machine, helpful to a human. We'll try and strike the right balance and perhaps encode some policy in metadata. Yeah, you're on.
One more comment about 47.
Yes.
So I think in some cases, when I have 1,000 servers renewing every once in a while, I don't want them to get error messages back.
Yep.
They're unattended. So for the simple cases, like, the CA just changed their policy from every 90 days to every 85 days for some strange reason. I do want the CA to modify the request and issue no matter what. Otherwise, the whole setup is bricked.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I think
So
part
the
of,
CA needs to have responsibility and stuff, but,
Yeah.
you know.
I think partly that maybe, we could maybe mitigate that with some of the policy proposal by,
Nobody's going to implement code that reads the JSON policy and modifies the request accordingly. I don't believe that's going to happen.
Edgar, what's your prediction?
No. I'm not sure I was going to say anything different. So, I mean, another possibility would be to give, the other possibility is to give the CA some trivial amount of latitude for fuzz, right? So I think that the expiration date is the one everybody's focusing on. And, if someone asks for 90 days, is it my responsibility to give them exactly 90 times 86,400? If a plus or minus by a second, am I in violation of policy? If I don't take leap seconds into account, I mean, like, all I'm saying is like that would you say that that is a non-conformant CA if they were a second short or a second long? And so in that case, I'm saying is it not possible to cover the three most common cases and say CAs are permitted to deviate by X% in either direction for these three most common cases?
Yeah, I think to a certain degree, it's the CA's decision what to issue for the CA, subject to their obligations. So I think we probably can't make a must-level statement here that would result in absolute compliance or non-compliance. But, well, exactly. So I think we can have some very strong should toward fail. Should fail instead of modifying, but leave it open for the CA's policy. Are you capturing that in the issue? Okay. Yeah, great. Ted is updating the issue as we speak. All right, I think we're good with that one. Next. Challenges. So I filed an issue this morning for something we talked about for a while. This is a trivial proposal. This is when, this is another case where you need to pop out of the automated process and have a human do something. So the question is, when you're validating response. Thank you, George. You're validated. Do you feel validated now? Yeah, so remember, challenges are how we verify possession of domains. We've tried our best to come up with automated mechanisms to do that here that can be fully automated, but there's some things that can't be done automatically. If you're trying to use this for EV issuance, for example, you might need people to upload documents to some place to prove that they are a certain legal entity. So to pop out of the automated process, the PR I've put up at number 111, you can see it on GitHub, it just has a very simple challenge. It says, here's a URL to go to. Please send a human to this web page, have them follow the instructions there. And there's no content to the response. The response is simply acknowledged, I've sent someone there. And the CA updates that. Does that sound broadly sensible to people? Any objections to taking that as is? Anyone thinks we shouldn't do this because it's not useful? Yeah, Stefan.
Oh, sorry, just a question that came to my mind. If we can do out-of-band challenge, is that also a way to resolve the possibility to do like EV search where you have very different things than just domain validation?
Yeah, that's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the idea is we'd like to define, we obviously have an extensible challenge space, so you can define many different types of automated validation mechanisms for different types of identifiers. But there's going to be identifiers that you can't validate completely automatically. So we should have this way to do other things that you can't do, that need a human in the loop.
Are we intentionally ignoring the issue of how the Acme client gets to talk to the human and get it to link this, to click the link?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in typical IETF fashion, we are not dealing with the user interface, user experience issues. We are simply assuming that somehow this Acme client, be it a daemon running on a server or what have you, can get access to a human to complete this thing. And if not, it can't get the authorization. No, I guess we could put a requirement that it be an HTTP URL or HTTPS URL in there. Um, oh, right.
Ted Hardy, I definitely think if we are going to use a URL, we should limit the URI schemes that are permitted. There was a suggestion in the issue that came from E. Baker that pointed to his own proposal for this written up some time ago, which proposed to use a set of steps which are outlined in the actual message rather than to use a redirect to a URL. Is there a particular reason you want to have the redirect to a URL because of some complexity, because of inclusion of forms, or because of something like that?
I think the redirect to the URL was simply because we are adding this explicitly because it is not automated and needs user involvement.
Right.
And so we might as well just we're going to have to punt to some level anyway. So we might as well just punt to something that's user facing to start with.
Okay, and certainly there are some advantages in terms of being able to use accept language and other things for content negotiation to the server in case there are different human languages supported. But I think it probably warrants some thinking about what the limitations on that URL should actually be. I mean, if, for example, somebody points you to a reverse mortgage site, are you really going to be okay with taking out a reverse mortgage in order to get the CA challenge done? Well, hopefully you read it and go, no, I'm not. I don't want that. But it's probably worth thinking a little bit about whether there are any limitations to where you can point and what schemes you want to point with.
Yeah, that's a good question. In particular because this is something that the server is sending, which means that it's only authenticated by TLS, so you might have, say, a CDN in the middle. Yeah, so that's, would you imagine something like requiring cores from the destination?
I haven't thought about it enough, but something like that.
Yeah, so for those who don't have the web in cache, cores, cross-origin resource sharing, is a way that's used in the web for a target domain to authorize an initiating domain to fetch resources from it. So we could use that here as a way for the target of the pointer from Acme to say, I allow requests to come into me from this Acme server. And so presumably your mortgage site wouldn't have that information there to allow it. Okay, so you're noting that in the bug.
Just to take a quick hum of the room, how many people believe they understand this issue? Please hum now. Ooh. I'm gonna hope people just weren't paying attention. The question I'm asking, he said, speaking very slowly, how many people think they understand the issue that's currently in front of you? If you believe you understand it, please hum now. Well, that's a little better. Great. Who believes they need more time to understand it? Okay. Who believes that they never plan to understand it? Please hum now. Oh, a couple of people raised their hands, not even humming. Okay, so I think that the current resolution of this is that we will write up something that is based on a URI redirect, but think about what the security characteristics of that URI need to be before it's finalized. So that will happen on list. Is that an okay resolution for everybody? If not, please get to the mic and suggest something different. All right, seeing no one at the mic line except Russ, who's looking at me very quizzically, trying to decide whether he wants to get up. No? Okay.
All right, so I think what I'll plan to do is write up a PR. Yeah. So that people can see exactly what's being proposed, and then I'll send it out to the list for people to say yay or nay. All right, that was an easy one. The remainder of these are proposed variants on 88 and 89 are proposed variants on the DNS and HTTP challenges. On the third request, a challenge that runs on a port that's allocated specifically for Acme, so that you don't have to bother your DNS server or your HTTP server. You just run a validation thing on its dedicated port. I'd like to propose that we defer these and not incorporate them in the base spec. As I said above, we obviously have this extensible challenge space. And so if you want to do validation differently, it's very easy to define a new identifier for a new challenge type and use that variation. So if people wanted a DNS version that would walk up the DNS tree and check higher levels in the tree for where a record is, they could do that. Even though the one we define in the base spec with the label DNS only checks the specific name you're checking. So by defer here, I mean that we just won't implement them in the base spec. They'll be left for extension specs to do later if people want to do them. Anyone who feels that these are critical to have in the base spec? Again, does anyone understand what the issue is here?
No. You know? Don't ask that question.
All right, hearing no objections, I'll tag those in the repo as deferred. Oh, are you making some notation there? Okay, great. Ted is notating those. All right, so those of you reading the list may have noticed a nice thread the other day where Karthik Bhargavan posted his analysis of Acme. He had created a ProVerif model of the protocol and asked it if the protocol was secure. And the answer was mostly yes, with a few exceptions. So one thing Karthik noted was that because we only have this resource binding and binding to a resource class and not a specific URL or a specific server, it's possible for a man in the middle to redirect a request from one server to another. Now, at one level, this is not a huge vulnerability because you go through the same process, you get a certificate, it's just not from the CA you expected it to be from. But it still seems like it's something nice to nail down. So the proposal we discussed on the list is to replace this resource field in the in all of the request objects with a URL field and have the client specify the URL it thinks it's sending this request to. I discussed this with Jacob Hoffman Andrews off and on when we were earlier in the development of Acme, and shied away from this in the past because of the complexities involved in URL comparison. But I think I'm okay with it now, given that this is the client stating its idea of what goes here, and the server, it's up to the server to sort of protect itself by checking that this URL looks plausible to it. There's not necessarily a need for a byte accurate comparison. There can be some fuzz. Ted, I feel like you know about URLs. How do you feel about that?
I think your statement that URL comparison is complicated is an understatement.
So do you think we should avoid things that might imply a need for URL comparison?
So the amount of implementer complexity here is potentially kind of problematic. And just to give people a flavor of what's happening here, if you look at this https://example.com Acme new auth C, in a typical URI comparison, anything in the authority section there that's presumed to be a DNS name could be represented in mixed case and be considered a match from a URI perspective because that particular part of the URL is case insensitive. In many cases, having example.com dot, because dot represents the null label, also means that you would compare them and consider them equal. There are cases in which the presence or absence of percent encoding for something which does not formally require it, but for which it is not forbidden, would result in something which compares as equal. So it's definitely the case that it's possible to do this, but it's not the case that you can do it simply. And so there's a fair amount of kind of parsing code that has to go in to be able to say, yep, these two are from the URI perspective equivalent. They will dereference the same resource, and they are considered the same identifier to that resource, which are two different questions. And I kind of wonder how much we actually have to allow that kind of comparison to rule the day here, and whether we actually should be simply saying, look, the signature's over whatever form of URI was given. And if you can't match it because your ability to generate the same form of URI is broken, you are a corner case and we are not going to fix you. There's some temptation to head in that direction, but there will be cases where that causes a spurious failure. But I'm much better off, I think, if we have some spurious failures because example.com did not match example.com, even though they would dereference the same and might be the same identifier. I'm kind of more okay with that kind of spurious failure, but it's really kind of it's a whose ox gets scored here. The implementation complexity versus the number of times somebody's going to call you up and say, this didn't work for some unknown reason, where the unknown reason is, what they typed in didn't exactly match what the URL looked like, even though it returned the same thing.
We have a comment from Ron in Jabber saying, is there any good reason not to just consider the URI a literal string token that gives us the guarantee we need without the complexity?
Ted Hardy again. If you do that, then advice to the people who are emitting these strings that they will be considered literal tokens, and that they should do whatever canonicalization they're going to do very, very consistently is important. Because otherwise, there are different ways of kind of coming up with what the particular URL should be. And if the code path isn't very consistent about what the canonicalization applied is, then you will result in this not being given your string match. But I think that kind of implementation consistency may be easier to get than the parsing consistency on URL match.
So I note that all of the URIs that might appear there are provided to the client by the Acme server. So if it's a static resource like new authorization or new certificate, you got it from the directory. If it's a specific authorization or a specific account, you got that from the location header. And so the client has, it seems at least you have some ability to guarantee that you've got a byte accurate representation of what the server considers to be the right URI. Modulo modifications, people rewriting location headers and things like that.
Ron responded saying, that is why I suggested we call it resource instead of URI on the list.
Matt Miller, given that there are ways to get this, maybe it seems fine to just let it be the URI and say in the spec it's matching. And if you do anything else, sucks to be you.
Should use the same thing you got from the server. If you re-encode it somehow,
Okay, you can't just say matching, really. You have to say, okay, I want to do octet by octet comparison. What you do if you encounter a byte order mark. What you do if, well, so there are a bunch of corner cases that our friends who will get to review this will find for us. But
yeah.
I think if you say, look, we want octet by octet matching for this, and we're going to handle the fact that there will be occasional spurious failures, that's okay. You on the server side, you handle the canonicalization to limit those. Since your help desk is the one taking the call, you have an incentive to do that. But we really have to understand that there are going to be cases, especially around the mixing of L to R and R to L, where the amount of pain that this can generate is surprising to people who don't deal in those worlds.
Now, I would note that on the list, there was an alternative to this approach discussed, which was to use something like the token binding protocol.
No.
So, would you like to elaborate on that, Rich?
No, that's, sorry, some guys.
Okay, so the question is, would we prefer to take on the pain of URLs or the pain of token binding?
So, a clarifying question is from the chair.
Get the mic.
Yeah. Would saying that the processing rules for the URL is that the server must recognize it as itself be enough weasel wording? No?
Because it's not itself, it's the full path and the
Well,
entirety of the URL.
I mean, for the server to recognize the URL as the correct one.
Well, so you could require that the server match the scheme and authority section, and the server may ignore the path. Yeah, maybe not.
Okay.
Because it's yeah. All right, we'll try and make some words, and then we'll see what happens.
Okay, so this is definitely one. Please raise your hand if you've ever written URL parsing code. Okay, this is a very large number of people. Yay, I'm so happy. Given that you have done that, so those people who raised your hand, do you think canonicalization followed by byte for byte comparison is enough for this use case? If so, please hum now. If you believe that byte for byte comparison, post-canonicalization by the server, is not enough, please hum now. Okay, Phil, you have a question. Why don't you go to Mike?
Yeah, it might be an unpopular view, but my view of canonicalization is that it has never solved a problem and it has created many.
Okay,
so my preference would just be byte for byte comparison of URL for string, and that's what has worked in the past.
These are internal nodes. I mean, IDX, I mean, like, they're just strings.
So the reason we're saying byte for byte is exactly the point George is raising. There's a very serious difference between saying character for character and byte for byte, because some of the composed characters will match even though they are not byte for byte equivalent if you're doing character by character matching. Okay, so back to the line.
Ron, on Jabber, it says, I think parroting the literal octets the server sent is the right answer, and agrees with the previous statement.
Okay, so stripping canonicalization out of the previous statement sounds like the result that we'll look for in the PR and then review on the list. Everybody okay with that next step? Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
All right, yeah, thanks. Good discussion. I'm glad we didn't end up with token binding. All right, so next issue. So as I mentioned before when we were talking about recovery, Karthik pointed out that contact-based recovery with the click-a-link form is not so great when you've got a possibility that someone might be able to point that to redirect some things. So this is sort of an intermediate suggestion. It's not immediately addressed to recovery, but it's designed to make recovery, adding back some recovery later, easier. So in rollover right now, we have the structure where we take the fingerprint of the original key, we have the new key sign the fingerprint of the old key, and then we sign again with the old key to say the old key consents to the rollover. So again, as we said before, we have consent from both the old key and the new key. The proposal here is to switch the order of old and new here. And so you have the old key authorize the new key to act for it, and then the new key sign again over the whole thing to say, I consent to take this thing over. The idea of that change is to make it forward compatible with bringing a recovery scheme in that sort of fits into the same overall framework. So you can just replace the signature by the old private key with a MAC by a recovery private key, assuming that some has been configured by some magic that we don't have right now. You know, see, yes, MAC key. Oh, did I leave? Oh yeah, ignore the priv there. It's a MAC key. So it's a symmetric key, you know, some random looking string that the CA has provided to the client to use for account recovery. So the idea is to have the same overall construct for rollover and recovery, ignoring MAC key, ignoring recovery key provisioning for the moment. Does anyone, any questions, comments about this? I think it looks, it holds together cryptographically. I haven't done thorough analysis, but you know, it seems like we have the same double signature authorization over the rollover as before. It seems like we have the right semantics here of the old key in the form of the recovery key authorizing the new key to take over as we would want for recovery. Questions, comments? Ron?
Jabberoom comment from What the Fuck says, still seems backward, but I get the idea. Will be compatible with Mac.
So what was that last part?
But I get the idea to be compatible with Mac.
Okay, great. All right. What was that? Yeah. It's above my pay grade. Okay, great. So I'll sketch out some implementation for this and make a PR. We'll probably have Karthik, as he's refining his model, get it incorporated and make sure it doesn't cause any unexpected cryptographic side effects. But I think this should be neutral from a rollover point of view, and it should make recovery a lot more secure and immune from some of the redirect attacks that he'd come up with. All right, next. Wildcards. This should be, everyone wake up. George, you got it. So wildcards is something that everybody's been talking about and we haven't done anything about for this whole time. How do we do them? We've got multiple issues talking about wildcard. We've got a PR providing, trying to add support. Right now, the current text says when you submit an authorization request for a DNS identifier, it must not have a wildcard character in it. No wildcards in the DNS authorization scheme. No wildcards in DNS identifiers. So it's pretty hard for provision, and there's no challenges that are authorized for, or that are designated for use with wildcards. So the document as it is right now is pretty hard incompatible with wildcards. In part, this is just my kind of queasiness with the notion of wildcards and what you might want to do to feel comfortable with them. People who in the room who are representing CAs who issue wildcards, I'd love to learn what you do and what you think we should recommend here. But from a protocol point of view, I wanted to make a little bit of a radical proposal. Next slide, please. And that's to use a different HTTP status code. So one of the, somewhere deep down in the lesser known reaches of the HTTP status code registry is one called 412, or for precondition failed. That's the way for the server to say to the client, I didn't like your request, but there's something you can do to make it so that I'll like your request. So what this would mean in this case, the idea in this case would be to sort of reverse the normal order of things. Acme right now is very proactively oriented. The idea is that the client shows up, it says, I want to assert for example.com and example.net. It does authorization for example.com, authorization for example.net, and then it asks for the cert. It assumes that it knows what the CA wants before it starts. The proposal here would be to flip that on its head, have the client, enable the client to send a new cert, to show up fresh, never seen the CA before, make an account, and immediately send a new cert request. Say, here's the CSR I want you to sign. And then the CA pushes back and says, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not just going to issue that. You need to do an authorization for example.com, an authorization for example.net. I'm not saying we require this model, but we can allow it. And the reason I bring this up in the wildcard section, I think it'll be useful for some other stuff we're going to talk about later on. But in wildcards, I think this is a much cleaner way to handle it. Because what you deal with now, wildcards are not things that exist in the DNS. They're used to synthesize DNS records in config, and they're used to match DNS records in certificates. But they're not DNS objects. They don't appear in resource records. They don't appear in queries. So the idea would be to have the DNS identifier have DNS names, and to have wildcards appear in CSRs. So you'd send a CSR with a wildcard in, and the CA can say, please validate the root name for that wildcard, or please validate these 20 subordinate names, whatever the CA requires to validate that wildcard. So this is a proposal that is literally like a week old. Haven't even submitted it to the list. It's still a little sketchy, but thought I'd present it here for feedback on the overall approach. Ecker.
Seems too clever by half. So,
okay.
I mean, it seems like you're now putting two entirely different sets of things I can be authorized for. You can authorize for DS names or some arbitrary combination of crap that the CA might force me to do. So, I mean, this could be compatible, for instance, with saying, well, I would like to issue a, I'd like to issue a GSA certificate. Oh, now you have to do some entirely different thing. I mean, it's one thing, so if what you'd like to do is to have a is to open with a CSR in all cases. That might or may not be a good idea. But the notion that the notion that there's like authorizations for names and then implicit authorizations for other things strikes me as like, why would you do that?
So I don't think I was proposing to change the semantics of an authorization, right? An authorization means you have proved control of a name. How you get to that authorization might depend on what, you might get to that authorization because I know I'm supposed to validate example.com because that's what I want in the cert, and I presume that I needed that. Or you might get to doing that authorization because the CA told you to do that when you submitted a CSR. Either way, you've proved.
I don't understand what you're in the current semantics. You say I would like an authorization for food.example.com, and so there's some entry in the CA database that says now we should authorize food.example.com, and when I go and ask for start.example.com for a certificate with start.example.com in it, you've got to go look up in some database and say, is this guy authorized for this? And now you're saying there are two routes to getting things in that database. One of which is asking for a name, and one of which is providing a CSR. I don't understand why those are sensible to this. And in particular, like, I mean, as I say, like now there could potentially be other things in the database, like is allowed to get, I don't know, TLS certificates versus SMIME certificates. And so now what you're saying is you have two entirely different routes to database entries, one of which is via CSRs and one of which is authorizations. I don't see why that makes any sense.
So, I mean, is what you're objecting to the two routes?
Yes.
Okay, so pick one or pick the other.
Yes.
Okay.
And it seems to me that the obvious problem with this route is the client has no way whatsoever to know what set of things he has just established authorization for. So, for instance, the CA says, well, it turns out that anybody who wants to have, elliptic curves where the point starts with F. That's one authorization. And one that starts with E, that's another authorization. And you have no way of knowing whatsoever. So you have no way of knowing whether a given CSR will succeed or not. The advantage of the current design is that you in principle know whether a given thing you request will succeed or not. And if it doesn't work, then it's a hard fail. It's not like go back and try again. And so the problem with this is that there's some totally hidden algorithm from you that provides undefined semantics. You can't tell what's going to happen.
Yeah, the challenge with this model of predictability that you have, where if I've got authorizations for all the names in the certificate, then I know that it will, that the issuance will work, a module of the conversation we had earlier. That presumes a certain policy on the CA's part, right? It presumes that authorization objects implies willingness to issue. And the reason I got going down this path was from talking to some CAs that have more complex policies than that. Now I realize this is like the entire opposite end of the spectrum. This is like build an arbitrary dependency tree to walk up. But I wasn't sure where exactly in the middle to land.
But the underlying problem, right, is that it means that this basically says that a common set of design patterns which one wish to use, you can no longer use, which is I have one set of mechanisms that I use for establishing authorization, and another set of mechanisms that I use for issuing new certificates, and that the first category only needs to be online some of the time. And the second category needs to be online when I issue certificates. And what you're now telling me is you can never count on so in particular, then the nexus between those two is the authorization key. And so what you're now telling me is whatever crap I need to do to demonstrate ownership of the domain, I have to be able to do it any time. So I can't make new servers because maybe it'll ask me to like jump over a fence this next time. So like it's just a complete redesign of the model. I mean, like this just strikes me as like a complete new semantic for the model.
Okay. Stefan?
I'm sorry, but one thing, so please tell me what new things might be reasonable to ask for at this point that would require that kind of major redesign. What new things might the CA say in the CSR?
Wait, what do you mean?
My point is that there's a given, the CSR contains a class of information. It contains the domain names you're asking for plus some other crap. And at this point, and so at the point we provide the same with the CSR, so by hypothesis, you've authorized all the names in the certificate, right? That is, at the moment, you wouldn't even be allowed to ask for CSR with names that you're not already authorized for. You'd be expected to be denied. And so what I'm saying is, what new information might be in the CSR that the CA would now cause you to do new operations, and which of those we think were reasonable?
Well, for example, there are CAs that handle differently requests for certificates with different numbers of names in them, right? So that's not accommodated in this model where you assume that any combination of the names you've authorized can immediately be issued, right? Now, we're dancing around a little bit here, like the notion of payment, which is part of this, and I've got slides later about retrofitting for compatibility with existing CAs, but like there are CA policies that treat differently things like differences in numbers of certs, and that difference in numbers of names in the cert, and that treat groupings of certificates differently. So if you send in a request for RSA and ECDSA certs with the same contents, that combination of requests might be the same. And this is that would be another change in the request syntax. It's not a single certificate request, but there are CA policies that are predicated on that sort of semantic. Stefan?
Yeah, this, from a general standpoint, this approach scares me. Isn't this the same black hole as trying to send back an error if the CSR was wrong and trying to make them the client fix them? I mean, there are so many things. Isn't this a thing that you have to solve under either out-of-band challenge mechanism or a non-standard, you can have authorization methods that you can add that are, I mean, how can you standardize the process of doing this kind of validation or this kind of thing? It feels like it's going to be a really hard challenge.
Yeah, I know. I certainly agree that you can get into arbitrary complexity in this way. This was a reaction to seeing a lot of complexity in CA policies and trying to accommodate that somehow. Phil?
Yeah, Phil Baker, Komodo. It occurs to me that the way that we solve this in practice is that when we're doing this sort of thing, we don't actually have an unconstrained, we have an unconstrained space of possibilities in the protocol, but in practice, you're not going to be looking for an arbitrary a la carte set of requests. In most cases, you're going to be trying to access a particular profile that is defined out of band. So you're going to be trying to meet the CAB Forum BR requirements profile, or the CAB Forum EV profile, or some other profile that is named and labeled and bagged and tagged in IANA space. And the way to handle that, this whole combinatorial explosion thing, is to kick it all into IANA space with specification required.
Phil, while I've got you at the mic, since the way we got here was wildcards, can you enlighten the crowd as to what the existing practice is with regard to validating for wildcard issuance?
No, because I'm not Rob Stradling.
Okay.
Got 10 minutes.
Okay, so what do I have after that? That one, yeah, okay. Well, so let me just flip back to the last one. So on this, Edgar's comments are well taken. I think in combination with what Phil was saying, there might be sort of a limited form of sort of guidance that a CA could provide in an error message saying, I will not issue the certificate until you have completed these authorizations. Not creating an arbitrarily deep dependency tree, but simply suggesting that the client loop back and do some more authorization transactions. I think I will try and create that sort of constrained suggestion, something very limited, and I'll post a PR and see what people think. All right, next. Yeah, so, speaking of complexity, posted it, after talking to some, I apologize to any CAs in the room for calling you legacy, but CAs that don't yet do Acme, that don't, yes, excellent CAs, yeah.
Revenue producing.
CAs that have longstanding, well-developed policies and business practices around how they decide whether or not to issue a certificate. As things do when they've been around for a while, have nuances and different policies. And think of things think of the process they go through before issuing as a specific process that has specific steps that may or may not map onto what we've got to the rather specific flow we have in Acme. So the question is, what should we do about this? How much should we open up the door here to create flexibility and to incorporate other processes leading to issuance in this revision? One of the things we're going to talk about at the end, after we get through open issues, is how do we get to closure on this version of the spec, on this base V1 of the spec? And so the question we're going at here is this sort of in scope for V1 any sort of dramatic revision to accommodate other more diverse practices for issuance? Russ? I don't think the mic is picking you up.
Come to the front.
Russ Housley. So my view is the existing CAs have existing CPs. They have to comply to them. If the Acme spec is within their current CP, they might have to update the CPS to say how, but that's their internal problem. And so it's really, what box did they put themselves in when they wrote the CP? I think each of them has to make their own individual assessment.
Please don't say that I should go review CPs to decide how to design the protocol. I really don't want to review them. Right. Yeah, so in principle, yes, all of the extant CAs should have CPs that lay out what we should do. Although I would note, having read a CP or two, it is sometimes a little difficult to divine what exactly the process is that we need to match. Ecker?
I mean, yeah, maybe could you just briefly talk about what you think combinations we might want?
Let me get into the mechanism.
I mean, I don't mean less the mechanism. I mean, like, there's probably 49 different things that make it currently inconvenient, right?
Yeah.
And maybe, maybe 47 of them are unique to one CA only, and 3 of them are common or something. So I'm just trying to get this as what the things you wish to accommodate, not the mechanism.
Yeah.
I'm happy to hear the mechanism too, but.
So I posted some analysis. So the link there goes to, and I think it's on the tools page. You can.
I'm trying to click on it, but it's not working.
Yeah. Okay, recharter. So
I read it, but it's been a while.
Went through some analysis of looking at the SSL Made API, which happens to be a tool out there that fronts for a couple of different CAs. That had a couple of differences from Acme, which well, some of them go to what I was talking about before. So you send in the CSR first before you find out what you're supposed to do.
Yep.
You can, I believe, send in multiple CSRs at once as a grouping. And there was there's an explicit purchase step that is done after all of that finalizes the thing and causes issue.
Right. So
and then there's also a renewal thing where you can get you get back a meta URL for a series of certificates,
right,
and then you can pick them up.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the common theme here is decoupling the act of demonstrating domain validity from the act of demonstrating certificate issuance allowance. And so, for instance, I mean, to pick one example, say, I'm authorized for example.com, but they charge me a penny for every certificate. So I got to perform some new act every time I want to serve, right? I mean, that seems like the common theme here. And so,
one other thing that you're making me remember is that in some cases, authorization, and an authorization is only done within the scope of the specific issuance event. So you might have to reauthorize if you issue for the same name again.
Right. So, I mean, I'm trying to remember how Acme handles forced reauthorization. Like, so I'm authorized for example.com, and then the CA's policy is 90 days, and I come back at 91. What is it? And I ask for a CSR. What does it do?
Say it again?
The CA requires reauthorization at 91 days.
Yeah.
and I come back 90 days, and I come back on day 91 and ask for
Oh,
a
yeah.
second cert.
So right now, authorization objects have an expiration.
They just tell you.
They just say they are scoped in time.
Right.
Whereas I think this would be scoped to.
No, I understand. I guess
Interesting.
my point is that it's my responsibility to notice that the authorization is expired, and I just get a hard fail when I try to issue, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that you're right to point out that the question here is the relationship between the issuance event and the authorizations. Right now, what we've got assumes a particular relationship. It assumes that these authorizations, if you have authorizations covering the names, then you can issue.
Then they're necessary and sufficient preconditions for
Exactly.
issuance if issuance will ever succeed at all.
Right.
Which is what I was complaining about earlier, as you recall.
Right.
So it seems like basically that are there any systems like this that do not have this property that basically there's a second set of approvals? Are there any combinations that aren't basically not flavor? Are there any combinations that aren't of the flavor of I'm already authorized for the name, but there's some other additional shit that I have to do to get the certificate issued?
I mean, I'll let CAs in the room speak for themselves. My impression is that mostly it's, it's authorization and payment.
Right, which almost, and payment is also generally per issuance, not per authorization.
Yeah.
So-
And by authorization, I mean proving control of identifiers, whether that's DNS names or legal names.
Right, so I mean, in order to accommodate, it seems like in order to accommodate these use cases, not only would we require, a new phase at CSR issuance time, but also a whole class of new, effectively authorization types, right? That is, you'd have to create an authorization type called payment, or an authorization type called blah, right? So I think
Or
that's,
you'd have to create some other type of action.
right. So
cover that, yeah.
feel free to call it authorization or not as you please, right? I mean, maybe there's some, but as you say, but it seems like what you're telling me is that you might also have to accommodate a new authorization, right? Namely, you come in and you say, I want example.com, and the CA would say, now maybe you can hack this by saying the authorizations only last for a second or something, but the problem is that it's not paired properly to the thing.
So yeah, I think what I written up in the earlier proposal was like being able to tag authorizations as belonging to a specific scope. Like
Yeah.
where it is you tag it with a URL for an issuance in a certificate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this seems like, I guess, well, let me ask this question differently. Instead of as a design question, let me ask this question as a typical IETF adoption kind of question. What is the constituency for this set of changes? And is there a set of existing CAs which would not adopt Acme were we not to make these changes, and would adopt Acme were we to make these changes? Because if the answer to that is that's the null set, then we should not do this. If the answer is not the null set, then we should get from those people what their hard requirements are so that we can at least make sure we surface those. Because the worst case scenario would be adding a whole bunch of complexity and then failing to service requirements and still not having those guys do Acme, right?
Totally agree.
So I think the answer is not just the CAs, but there's also SSL, other third-party packages that wrap them. Okay.
Well, Spilhan Baker, speaking as a CA, my hard requirement here is that I have to have some way of putting a cash register on the protocol. And at the moment, I mean, like being a simple soul, I can't really work that out from reading the spec. I have to implement it. And I don't do production code, so I'm implementing it, but I'm not doing a production implementation. But so far, I don't know yet. As soon as I find something that I can't do, I will let you know. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that, there could be things that Komodo has that are hard, our set of must do, maybe a subset of Symantec or GoDaddy or whoever. I can't speak for them. I suspect that it isn't, though. The other piece that is a big worry for me is how do I do EV? And that's another thing that I'm not sure that I've got my head around yet.
Yeah. I agree that doing EV is a very worthwhile thing for this working to look at. I think that's a good next deliverable once we have a base spec to work from. Because unless we think that there's, a whole very different, a lot of difference in the validation process or in the issuance process, like it seems like we can still treat it in this general validate an identifier and issue for that identifier
Yeah,
framework.
the other one is LRAs, local registration authority.
Yep. So go down 2 slides, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the proposal here, this is maybe more of a meta proposal. I had written up a sort of grand scheme, grand architecture in that earlier proposal to try and accommodate all this stuff. But what I think I'm going to do is break this down into a couple of different things. Some form of preconditioned CA pushback suggestions so that you can do something like send in the CSR first and get requirements for authorizations. To accommodate these authorizations that are only applicable for a specific scope, some notion of scoping for authorizations, and then possibly some grouping of new cert requests or allowing you to send multiple CSRs in one request to accommodate processes like that. I think that covers at least some chunk of the variation I'm seeing in CA processes. Those seem like things that are small enough that maybe they're digestible and processable as individual PRs without having to get into a whole overall refactoring of the architecture.
So one thing I just think of this money thing off the top of my head, right? How would you imagine this being structured, right? So, I ask for a cert and it says, please give me $1. And how will my client decide whether to hand over the $1? And, and as you probably know, back the original chocolate design, right? You keep being pinged over. You basically keep trying over and over again. And it would say, well, now do this, now do this, now do this, right? Which is an attractive design in a world where you really don't know kind of what the guy can do and what he can't do. But what I certainly don't want to have happen is that I ask for, example.com, and then it just like loops for like 3 hours, like asking for $1 every time. That would be bad, right? And so, so I'm just trying to figure out like how we cabin this in a protocol design that doesn't effectively become and is my concern from the beginning of this meeting, doesn't become an open-ended set of instructions which you can force the client to do anything you want to do by driving them through enough steps, right? And and it seems like as soon as you have real world consequences for the things you're doing, suddenly that becomes difficult. So, I'm just trying to think about how you build this in a way that is flexible. I mean, the being wary of this point PZB is making, but the more you sort of say, well, we're not going to put any policy in the protocol, but instead the CA will just issue demands on you and you will comply with them or not, the more you have to worry about the client enforcing against bad CA behavior. And, and again, maybe you say, well, any CA which is in the trust anchor list, you got to basically trust. But I mean, this could be other kinds of CAs that you might have relationships with that you would have nowhere near such a strong inherent trust relationship.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you could bound a lot of that out by having effectively a single round trip. Like I send the CSR, the CA says you have to do this. So CA's in the room, I'm looking at you and saying, if when I send you a CSR, can you send me a complete list of instructions to
right.
process that?
So what you're saying now is like the rule, and then you're saying at least the client can say, well, I only, my limit is $1, it's $5, and
right.
And at least there's some chance that's going to work out. Right. I think so. Certainly it would be. I mean, it would be better, I think, if we could do that. And better. So maybe start by making a list of what the things the CA might demand at this time were.
Yeah.
And it sounds like largely give me some money. I gotta say I'm a little less excited about this grouping thing. This just seems like kind of a rat hole. I certainly understand that CAs might want to charge for, have differential pricing for multiple certificates, but it seems like that's not the only way. I mean, it's not the only way to do that.
It's also a fairly trivial protocol change. Like you just, instead of having one field, you have a list.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it certainly seems like, I understand that's that's something the CA might want to do, but I can imagine other ways to hack around that. A discount for the second one, or an external voucher, that kind of thing. So it seems like basically because I mean, the whole point of this is to be automatic. And so at the point where you're kind of trying to make, at the point where you're sort of like, well, what I want to do is offer this guy, what a deal, you can get 2 for 1. Now you're kind of out of the zone of automatic anyway. So.
Ted, could you file an issue for payment, please?
Yeah, that goes way beyond what I was thinking of for payment. I mean, like, my view of payment is there will be some account and that will be set up and it'll work kind of like Amex or whatever. And there will either be prepayment or post-payment. And that is not, the only thing that I think it would add to the Acme protocol would be possibly throwing you back to payment required and, you know, bouncing you back to some web page where that's explained.
Saying
to
like,
your
here's
account.
a URL, go see the web page we were talking about earlier for offline validation. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I was thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine actually it'll turn up, the system admin will get something in their mailbox saying, you tried to buy a cert, you didn't have the money, and then when they go to their dashboard, there'll be a message for them saying, you tried to buy a cert and you didn't have the money in your account. And so I don't think that that's something that we need to clutter at Acme with, and I want to avoid doing that.
Okay, great. All right, that's the end of open issues. So,
All right.
Rich, I think it's
Yeah,
your mic now.
Well, okay, Phil's got the next topic. Do we want to just continue through this on the draft? Because that's, or do you want to jump to Phil and then back?
You're the chairs.
That's to you, Ted.
I think we should probably jump to Phil and back.
Okay, yep.
Hello, I was banned in the naughty box. Okay, so I'm Phil Humbaker-Komodo. Next slide. So what I've been looking at here, you know, being a simple soul, I can't really understand specs until I've written them and implemented them. So I've been doing an implementation, and you know, at the moment, Acme is really very nice and clean. And my experience of doing previous web services is, you know, this is the point at which people start to decorate it. And I think that that's something we want to avoid. There's a whole load of stuff that could end up in the spec, you know, like how do you actually deal with the versioning? This rate limiting proposal is probably the first of many little bits of information that want to be stuffed in there for operational reasons. And when you look at that, most of that platform is stuff that could be shared between multiple protocols. And going to JSON has really big advantages because now we're dealing with a data description language, not a document format. So there's a lot of rubbish that we don't need that we've not got in JSON. Next slide. But it does have the cost that now we're the first to come along this way, and so all the stuff that exists there for XML web services, we either have to invent or decide we don't need. And if we decide we don't need them, then the risk is that we end up inventing them in every specification we write rather than in one place. And so the thing, you know, although there have been JSON specs before, I don't think there have been very many that have been really mission critical security apps. And so we're really creating patterns here rather than having one that we can follow. So next slide. And when you're looking at these things, encoding details really matter a whole lot. So I'm looking through the spec, and I see this thing, new authorization, example.com. Okay. So I see this bit here saying, signed as JWS. And I'm thinking, well, what's signed? You know, well, what's security sensitive there? Well, is the post URL sensitive? Is the host sensitive? And, you know, I have to now grovel into the spec to find out whether those things are actually changing the semantics. And there is this directory URL, it's just directory transaction for looking up where the endpoints are for the various transactions. And that's giving me a headache. And I try to avoid headaches. So can we go to the next slide? So what happens if we move away from HTTP completely? You know, what if we want to do a version that's working over a serial line and HTTP doesn't make any sense? What if we're doing an LRA, which is effectively looking like a proxy? And so all those HTTP headers are no longer there. If you've got them in your JWS scope, I don't know whether you do this in Acme, but I've seen it in some protocols. It's a really bad design pattern because you've then bound the application protocol to the very specifics of web transport. And, you know, all we're using the HTTP here for is extra port numbers in TCP. I mean, I'm one of the authors of HTTP spec. I do like it, but I don't want to use any HTTP feature here. I really do not. And you know, what happens if we want to do it in CBOR or some other fancy encoding? Okay, so next slide. So a better approach, in my view, would be to have a post, you know, just take the scope of the signature over only the HTTP payload. So nothing that's in the HTTP payload is ever signed, so we don't care about the HTTP headers anymore. We can drop them from the specification. We don't need to confuse people with them. But it then does mean that, well, it's not clear to me whether in this case resource is unique to this transaction or not. But if it's unique to the transaction, I think it should be the first thing that appears on the wire. And I'll come back to that in a moment in the next piece. So next slide. The other thing is that when I was looking at this, well, you know, what happens, you know, I've changed the message around. I've taken out this post thing. I was thinking, well, you know, well, what happens if now I've not got the CA's address in there? You know, so okay, we now have to add it back into the body of the message to say what the CA is. And when I was writing the slides, it occurred to me that this has actually caught a bug in the current spec. So if we go to the next slide. At the moment, example.com is overloaded in that you're using it as an element to describe your HTTP transport path and also as an identifier to tell you which CA you're directing the query at. Sorry, the transaction at. And those two are not necessarily the same. They're certainly not going to be the same if you're on a local network and you're directing all your requests to an external CA via a local proxy. And yes, there are ways that you could do this by delving right into the details of HTTP. Trust me, it's much better to rewrite the protocol so you don't need to care about HTTP at all. So in my proposal, I've separated out the semantics of those two fields, and I've got layer separation. So next slide. So the advantage here is we've completely decoupled from HTTP. If somebody now wants to layer it over that serial line to talk to an Internet of Things device, they want to move it over some future protocol that's better than HTTP, they can do that without having to rewrite Acme or any of the guts of Acme. You know, Acme is now abstracted properly and layered properly, which is what we should have for good architecture. Yeah, if you don't do that, it's like having web services that are kind of like groveling in the TCP stack. We all know that you don't want to do that. Well, it's just as bad having a web service that's groveling into the HTTP headers. It's also simplified the JWS stuff. So now it's just a simple blob. The only thing that you sign is the start and end of the payload. Well, the start and the end of the content in the payload. So you could move it to CMS, do that type of thing without any difficulty. You don't need to spin up a new working group to do Acme A for ASN1 or Acme for CBOR or whatever. You can get all those for free. And the other thing that this gets rid of is I can't get my head around the security problems of whether directory is introducing security problems or not. I'm a simple soul, and the way that I've always solved them in my protocol is that if ever a part of my protocol gives me a headache, I get rid of it. So this is a way of getting rid of the possible security issues that otherwise could plague us. So next slide, please. The other thing that comes up is nested versus flat, and this is a bit subtler in that at the moment, one of the issues that I have with Acme is if you look at a lot of our pieces, we've got challenges. Okay, we've got a type, HTTP 1.0.1. I've introduced a new one
new 01 that has a different field, parameter X. The problem with this approach is, next slide, well, JSON doesn't tell us what order the fields come in. So the type field is telling us how to parse this record that's about to come, only it's just come at the end of this object. This is a really bad design if you're trying to use the type of parser architecture that I use. Now, if we go to the next slide. So what's the problem? Well, your problem is that you're assuming that you're writing in a scripting language. If you write in something like C or C# or Java or any of the type-safe languages that some of our the security folk like to use, this is a really bad way of encoding. I really need to be able to know the type before I do the parse. Otherwise, what I've got to do is I've got to parse this data twice. First of all, I've got to parse it into a JSON parse tree, and then I've got to rescan that parse tree a second time to match it to the data structures. And I'd rather avoid that because I can't do things like change. If I know the types of the data at the start, I can know, well, this is an X transaction. I'll allow it more space before I complain. If somebody's doing a hello transaction and they're giving me 24 megabytes of data, I know it's wrong. If it's a put file transaction, maybe it was right. So the way that I think Bobby Tables would say you would do this is you parse the input data, you validate your input data, and only then does the application see it. And if it doesn't match, you reject it. So this is probably a bit stricter than most folk are doing at the moment, but that's the way that I think it should be done. So next slide. So this is a different way of doing it. So what I've done this time is I got rid of the type field and factored it out as a tag describing the object that follows. So this now means that the type of the data will always precede the data. So you always know what you're parsing before you start parsing it. So it's got the same information. It's slightly shorter by 3 bytes, I think. But the main thing is that now we can use any parsing technique. We're not stuck with doing the scripting approach. So you can use any language, you're not forced to use a dynamic binding language. So next slide. So my proposal is every message starts off with the Acme type, so you know what it is. So we don't depend upon the Acme, we don't depend upon the HTTP headers at all, completely decoupled from the transport. And we use the nested encoding instead of using type fields to describe what your structure is. And the advantage we get out of this, we get proper layer construction so that we can apply this as a pattern to other JSON applications where this type of stuff is going to matter a lot more. It's also much clearer because you know when you're reading the message that the first thing on the line is the thing that's telling you how to interpret what follows. And it allows you to use languages like C and C# and Java more easily. And it encourages us to follow this pattern. So that's it. So any comments? The disadvantage, of course, is that some folk would have to recode, but I don't think the coding changes would be that major.
Ted Hardy, simpler soul than Philip. So Philip, I have to say that both of us chairs were a bit surprised at this presentation because it's not what we thought you were talking about. And so we have not well prepared the working group because in the agenda, we actually linked to your lurk drafts because what we thought you were going to talk about was the need to have the work in that potential working group and this working group align well. Now, having now seen this, I believe what you're going to, but the missing context to this is that in fact, in lurk, you are proposing a mechanism that looks like this, that uses JSON over HTTP in a form that's architecturally similar to the form you propose here, and you're asking us now to reconsider the design of Acme to adopt something to align with that. Is that in fact the context?
Well, sort of. I mean, like, Lurk is one of the protocols that I think would follow this pattern.
Okay.
And I mean, at the moment, Lurk is a BOF. So when I was saying using this as a design pattern, what I should have said is, in my view, Lurk and Acme would be very good if they looked similar, as similar as possible. Maybe that's not completely achievable, but it's not just that one thing to follow. I think that what we're going to be seeing is a suite of crypto protocols appearing that are based on JSON.
Okay.
And I would like those to look like a family and not have their own individual idiosyncrasies.
Speaking as a very idiosyncratic member of my family, I'm not sure that that's achievable. But I will say that I think that the point you're making is actually a larger point than is appropriate for Acme, because you're asking for a new design pattern to be adopted, in essence, for security work in the IETF. And I'm going to go back to that now, and then ask you to reconsider whether or not this is an appropriate moment in the working group's work plan to reconsider its basic design pattern.
And while he's walking, we close the line.
So functionally, as chair, my question to you is, in order to do this, we would have to have a different draft to adopt that use this design pattern, or we would have to give instructions to our editor to completely change the current protocol spec to use this design pattern. One or the other, yes?
You would have to change the current spec, but I don't think that the specifications are that radical.
Okay, so because we did not prepare the group correctly for what this question would be, I don't want to take a hum here. We'll talk offline about whether or not we're willing to take a hum on this on the mailing list, but I think it's going to be radically influenced by the next piece, which is where do we go from here? So I'd like to bring up those slides. I'll take the questions from the line very quickly, but understand that we're currently tabling this in the American sense for the moment.
Richard, get ready.
So, okay, I mean, I guess I'm here. I have a certain amount of sympathy for this, having stuff split between the HTTP headers and the body is kind of unaesthetic. So I think that's something that all I understand has been analysis of it, so we have a relative amount of confidence in it. Though I've not personally analyzed it, that seems like a sort of not insane position that one might take. I have rather less sympathy for this argument about it's hard for you to write your C parser. Like modern languages have dynamic memory allocation, and like I mean, certainly like I have rather less sympathy for that position, and that seems like a fair amount of bike shedding on the protocol mechanics.
So, Matt Miller. So this was interesting to think about, although kind of to Ecker's point, I've got a bunch of software I'm working on that's in C and Java that we haven't had huge problems like you've theorized here. So maybe this would lead to better code, but I've got working code, and it hasn't caused us a lot of problems.
I say you wrote working code? Okay, Eric Berger, to do what you thought this would be will take more than 15 minutes, so I invite everybody here to come to the Lurk BOF tomorrow at 2 p.m. You know where it is? Tomorrow at 2 p.m. and one of your chairs will be so happy to put it up on the screen so it's right in front of your face so that you will come tomorrow.
Atlantic OC.
Atlantic OC, 2 o'clock tomorrow.
Go take it from the thing and then we'll close.
So
From the Jabber, Jacob Hoffman-Andrews declares, I think is good direction for Acme and would make the Boulder implementation cleaner, and Ron has general support as well. I like a lot of what he's saying here too.
Okay, so bring up the where do we go from here?
Thanks.
Yeah, we are constrained for time. Okay. Should I talk to this or Richard?
Go ahead.
All right. Okay, so here is a rough proposal for where we go. Clear out the issue list by May or June. Certainly, the issue list or the issues may get a little more complicated if there's consensus based on Phil's presentation. We'd like to get 2 clients, 2 servers interoperating. I would say that a second server, other than one in Boulder, Colorado, run by a nonprofit foundation, would be a really great thing. So if anyone wants to write some code. Assuming that the first 2 happen, or at least the first happens, it seems tenable that we could go to last call either before or just at 96, and at the next one, we discuss comments, any extensions we need to, and then we move forward after that. Any reactions?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that IETF will never have 2 implementations of. I think that's a completely unreasonable requirement to have 2 server implementations.
Okay.
I'd love to see one. I'm not arguing that, but I think it's unreasonable to require that before you go to last call.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking of this as a may, not a must.
Yeah, I think I wrote the original version of that slide and put that in as an objective. I would very much like to have that be the case, but I don't think it needs to be a process blocker.
Yeah.
Okay, so given that this is the proposed timeline for us, I guess there are 2 questions related to the architectural proposal that Phil Hallenbaker just made. One is to our editor. So, editor, look up. Were there consensus to adopt this proposal? How long do you think it would take in editing to make this set of changes? Yes.
I think I would have to look back through the slides to be sure, but it seems, I don't know, it would be a couple weeks of editing time, so interspersed with everything else.
Okay, would it change this schedule?
It might add a week or 2, but I don't think it's a huge difference in it.
Okay, the reason I asked the question that way is if we felt it would change the schedule substantively, add another meeting cycle, something like that, obviously then we would need to ask the working group which one of these to prefer, meeting the meeting schedule or considering the architectural changes, right? It sounds like we could consider both. So I'm going to ask Phil to write a draft or a PR.
Yeah.
Phil to write a PR, and then on the mailing list, we will run a discussion around the PR to see whether or not the architectural changes from the specification side seem like something that are tractable to complete in time. And then we will consult the development community, or kind of in parallel, the development community, to make sure that we have at least one running server that runs the code as it would be newly specified before we go to working group last call. Phil, you had a question.
If I get the changes, I can probably get another server out.
Useful to know. I do feel a little bit like this is a fairly major set of spec changes for where we are, and that while it may be somewhat simpler in theory to some of the HTTP interactions that are there, I'm particularly guided by history here that when somebody like Matt tells me that he's got code that works, that the advantages of making these against code that already works is not terribly compelling to me as an individual. That doesn't mean no as a chair. I'm just saying that this might be better doesn't mean that what we have might not be good enough.
So Matt Miller again, one point of clarification. I've got code that is using JSON for security reasons that's working.
Mm-hmm.
It's not specifically Acme at this point in time, but it is other things that that are used in security contexts that is working.
Okay. The job of a chair in general is to make sure that the work completes. And so the arrival of things which delay the work completing naturally makes us very nervous. You can see Rich over there. He's trembling. I mean,
I think I've wet myself.
I'm not repeating that to the mic.
TMI.
You had something from the Jabber?
Yeah, Ron declares, we already don't have a server that implements all of -02 yet.
Okay, so the point's made that we're still early enough on. Okay, so we will expect an action item is going to Phil Helen Baker to write a PR. Today is what, the 4th? Tax day, April 18th?
Yeah.
All right, so April 19th, so he can have his taxes done. We'll expect the PR on or before.
Your Honor, Schiffer, I'm a little puzzled by the direction of this discussion. I would imagine that syntactical issues, okay, might affect the deadline a little bit and might have, I mean, there'll be some heated discussion of whether you want these structs or the others, but I think the issue of whether commercial CAs can actually live with the way the protocol is defined is much more important. And this still sounds like an open issue based on the previous discussion.
So I believe the commercial CAs was actually raised as a different issue. And so I put an issue in the issue tracker around that. In particular, one of the critical things there is whether or not this allows for a payment to be associated with it. And that seems completely independent of this syntactical issue. Am I missing something?
It is independent.
Good.
What I'm saying is, I would imagine that it is much more of a precondition to this, to actual last call / publication, than the syntactical changes.
Well, but there is the other difference between the two is we have Phil who was working on something and contributed here. There aren't many CAs in the room who have commented. And so while we can't, we think it's useful, and we'll make a best effort to address what we think we understand of the CA registration process, and Phil certainly offered some
So we
advice.
actually do have.
Yeah. Well,
In terms of, all right, I was not aware that this item would be on the agenda when I originally made the proposal. So I probably wouldn't have couched it in these terms if I knew that you were going to go to make a last call proposal. However, I think in terms of getting the draft finished and being confident in it, the first set of issues of decoupling from the HTTP piece completely, I think that will actually speed things up and simplify things, because if you've got modularity and you only need to think, if you modularize properly and you shrink the number of things you have to think about, it is quicker. If you've got HTTP and Acme intermeshed.
I think we're aware of your opinion on this. I do point out that for the current protocol, we have a formal analysis from Karthik that would have to be redone if we redid the protocol syntax to the level we're discussing. So there's definitely some confirmation that would have to be done that it still met the same tests with a new syntax. Just one last thing, because we're actually over time.
Yeah, sorry. So when you talk about two different servers interoperating, there's a lot of value in that. But I think ensuring that the target audience for this protocol includes the people who are actually doing CAs today, I think that's even more important.
So I would like you to please re-review our charter, because our charter definitely makes a very strong statement about what our target audience is, and I think if you review that, it might be handy. Okay, I want to thank everybody for coming and participating on the list. We remind you that we have a very aggressive schedule now. You all nodded and smiled at that, especially Russ. It was a beatific smile on Russ's face. He was like, there's going to be a last call. I'm so happy. So, we want to keep Russ smiling as well as the rest of you. So we need aggressive participation from you to match the aggressive schedule.
So please do look at the issue list, make comments on the drafts. You can make comments on the drafts as they stand now, not waiting for this PR from Phil, because the semantic issues will not be changing as a result of this syntactical change. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll talk to you soon.
Blue sheets up to the front.